This is FRM Part 2, Book 2, Credit Risk Measurement and Management, and the chapter on netting, closeouts, and related aspects. And this is an entirely descriptive chapter. It's not nearly as long as the last one that we covered, and so hopefully I'll get through this slide deck way faster than I did the previous one. But let me go ahead and give you just a quick summary of what we're doing here. Let's suppose that for some reason that I owe you $10 and you owe me $6. Now, in order to complete the terms of that trade or that transaction, I have to go to the bank and get out a $10 bill, and you have to go to the bank and get out a $5 bill and a $1 bill, and then we exchange. Well, the process of netting is, of course, just based on common sense. It's a lot easier if I just hand you $4, then I'm the only one that has to go to the bank. And that's a simple notion, one that is illustrated in the very commonly used vanilla interest rate swaps, where I might be paying a fixed rate and you might be paying a floating rate, and then we just net those payments. Both of us are obligated to pay, right? I'm paying you a fixed rate, you pay me a floating rate. Well, we'll just net those, we'll net those cash flows, and that's a much more efficient way of executing the terms of the transaction. But it gets a little bit more interesting when either you or I are either nearing default or are bankrupt or have a change in our credit rating or maybe our Moody's bond rating. And then what happens with closeouts and these related aspects? So that's what we're going to do in this chapter, and that's what these learning objectives are going to tell us about. So explain and describe, lots of those action words. So we'll look at the ISDA Master Agreement, which has changed pretty regularly over the years. There's summarized netting and closeout procedures, looking at some advantages and disadvantages. And of course, in a previous chapter, we talked about counterparty risk and default risk and credit risk. So we'll talk about ways to reduce that. And then the last slide or two will be on termination events. Now, we spent a lot of time talking about counterparty risk, so let's go ahead and do just a quick recap here. Cross-product netting, often known simply as netting, in which cash flows are just offset, much like that example I gave you a moment ago about paying the fixed rate of interest and receiving the floating rate of interest. But then again, I said it gets a little bit interesting when there's someone nearing a default. So a closeout is an immediate cancellation of all contracts with that defaulted party. And so if there are multiple contracts with that defaulted party, then some of them will probably have positive mark-to-market values and some will probably have negative mark-to-market values. And so you just combine those into a single net payable or receivable. Look at that third block point there. This is probably a good exam question. Netting is viewed as reducing settlement risk, of course, while closeout netting reduces pre-settlement risk. Now, this International Swaps and Derivatives Association is the body that can set rules and regulations in the over-the-counter market. Remember, when these derivatives are traded on an organized exchange, it's the organized exchange that gets to set those standardizations and all those terms. But when these contracts are traded between and among financial institutions, and remember, all kinds of financial institutions are interested in the derivatives market, they need a more broader, kind of more general set of rules. So look at the second block point. The master agreement provides standard documentation that governs the OTC derivatives to increase efficiency and to reduce counterparty risk. So of course, all of those counterparty risks that we discussed in that last chapter apply here. Now the bottom block point there indicates what I said just a few moments ago, several versions of this master agreement. And of course, these things change over time depending on financial crises, like back in 2008, which was an emerging issue. And remember that credit default swaps were the target of lots of attacks about the cause of that financial crisis. And it's my personal belief that the actual contracts really didn't have anything to do with the crisis. It's because we didn't identify the risks and quantify the risks and then manage the risks. You should be sick of me saying that to you in these videos. All right, how about payment netting? Let's suppose I'm party A and you're party B. I owe you 500 and you owe me 400. There's that example I gave you in the very first slide. And so why don't we just go ahead and net those? It's a lot easier if I just reach into my pocket and hand you $100. Combine all the cash flows into a single payment. Now, closeout netting is just a little bit more interesting. Of course, the mathematics of it work the exact same way. If I owe you $1,200 and you owe me $1,000, and notice that these are mark-to-market values. So, back here, these are just kind of regular cash flows, like in a regular old currency swap, or an interest rate swap, or an equity swap, or lots of other derivative contracts that are out there. Here we want to close out this netting for some reason, for some other reason. And so that mark-to-market then would flow from me to you as $200, and that's with the closeout netting. Now, I think there are two pages, 2 slides on advantages and disadvantages, and these are probably pretty obvious notions to you. Exposure reduction, of course, financial discipline. Remember in a previous slide I said, here, let's suppose that we're right here on a swap. Remember, all swaps are initially valued at 0, and so what's going to happen over time? If this is an interest rate swap, the value of our swap is going to go up and down, depending on how current interest rates move in relation to that fixed rate. And so, suppose, if we're just doing this a little bit above and a little bit below and a little bit below, boy, that doesn't really require much financial discipline, because we know that if that continues, that we'll either have to pay a smaller amount or receive a small amount once we get to that 6-month time period, if this is 6 month on settlement. But suppose that we go all the way up here and then all the way up here. Can you see my hands way above? Suppose we get a contract that has very high positive or very negative mark-to-market values, then that's when this financial discipline effect will become more obvious. And then I have talked to you guys before about layering one derivative on top of another derivative. So, if you get way up here, what you could do is get out of that contract, or you could just enter another contract that has the opposite position. So here's the first one, then you layer it with the second one. So that's what I'm saying in that unwinding positions, the reverse the trade with the initial counterparty, removing both the market and the counterparty risk. I mean, the problem with that is that you may not get favorable conditions. Now, I said this before, if I'm one financial institution and I have a trade with you, but we have an agreement with Eurodollars and treasuries and interest rates and equities and alternative investments. We have all these different things. What the easiest thing to do is to keep track of all those multiple positions. And then, of course, stability. This is what you hear all the time from governing bodies, is that all of our decisions are going to improve the stability of the financial system. And of course, netting does that to an extent, and maybe even a great extent. But going back to taking ownership of your position in every one of these contracts, the stability depends on your ability to manage, what did I say? You don't want me to say it again. To manage, the third part is to manage those risks. And so if you're managing those risks properly, then your positions are probably going to be more stable. Now, remember our conversations about organized exchanges, which rely very heavily on clearinghouse corporations to keep track of all of the trades. But let's take a look at an example here. Suppose there are 3 parties, A, B, and C, and let's just start with B. Let's suppose I'm B and I owe 8 upwards and I'm receiving 12 this way, but A and C have a relationship between themselves as well. So it's clear that we should probably do some multilateral netting here. So of course, let's just do the math quickly on one of these. I owe A 8 and C owes me 12. And so the easiest thing for me to do is just receive 4, right? But we can't do that unless there's another person. And that's what that central counterparty is in the middle that I have in orange. So there's another organization, another entity in there that's keeping track of all of these bilateral trades and then increases in efficiency by just doing this netted gross exposures. Now, of course, A and B and C, we're willing to pay the central counterparty generally a small fee to make our life easier and to make this netting much more efficient. Now, going back to my example here, when we're way up here or way down here, or now if we're way up here, what we need to do, and this is positive, right? Mark to market positive. We need to worry about actually getting those funds from that counterparty. And if that counterparty is the giant, solid Gibraltar financial institution, then we probably don't have much to worry about. But suppose that financial institution over here is Jim's financial institution and snow shoveling service. Then when you get way up here, then you got to look over here and say, okay, Jim, I'm not sure you're a solid financial institution over there. How about if I can exercise my acceleration clause? All right, so some of these contracts contain acceleration clauses which permits these future payments to be accelerated, and that acceleration is most likely due to a default or a credit migration. Of course, a credit downgrade would do this. Now, notice I have at the bottom, this is different from, acceleration is different from a closeout. The closeout terminates all the contracts, but this thing doesn't. All it does is it moves those payments to today or sometime, in the relatively near future. Now, this part of the chapter here discusses negativity and positivity of the mark-to-market. And so note that first block point there. For netting clause to be useful in a derivatives contract, there must be some chance that the instrument will have a negative mark-to-market at some point in its lifetime. So what does that mean? That if we're here, if we're always positive, and we have all these contracts that are always positive, for some reason, forget about that reason, well, then there's no reason for us to pursue aggressively this concept of netting, right? If an instrument can only have positive values, it can never have a beneficial impact on the overall umbrella exposure. Remember that in that last slide deck, I had a picture of an umbrella there. Now, going up like this, I was doing that with the interest rate swap contracts, and that's probably not what we're talking here. We're talking here mostly about options. And remember the big difference between, there are lots of differences, but the big difference, at least at initiation, between a regular old derivative and an option contract is there's an exchange of that premium. And remember that if you buy an option today, whether it's an option on currency or an option on the S&P 500 index, or even if it's an option on a swap contract, remember you pay that option today, and that option has intrinsic value and it has time value. And so that number, the value of that option, will always have time value, even if it's way out of the money. It will always have time value. The value of that derivative is going to be positive, right? And so what that does is that kind of influences our choices and our chances of having a negative mark-to-market. So what do I have there? Good examples. I have swaption. And one of my favorite things to teach my derivative securities class is how to price a swap contract, which is really just the difference between a fixed and a floating rate bond, but then how to use, some kind of a Black-Scholes-Merton option pricing model to price a swaption. So we have those things. We have foreign exchange options and equity options. Those are good examples. Now, the chapter then goes on to a section about, let's suppose that you have a trade that only has positive mark-to-market. And there are some good reasons why you would still put them under a netting agreement. And I like the third checkpoint down here at the bottom. And this goes back to my conversation about layering derivatives on top of derivatives. And so look, if the option position needs to be unwound at some point, you're going to execute a mirror trade to try to eliminate that counterparty risk, or at least substantially reduce it. So you have this one option, and then you're going to try to mirror that trade. And so it makes some sense then to do some netting. That makes perfect sense. And then let's just move up here. You know, if you have all of those trades included in one netting agreement, then you might, depending on the derivative and depending on whether or not you own the underlying asset or that you need to buy the underlying asset in there, you might get favorable collateral terms. And then the first one I think is the least compelling, but this is all part of the managing risk management strategies, is that you know that sooner or later you're going to have a negative mark-to-market at some point in the future. And so you have all these positive mark-to-market, and then what you might want to do is agree to net, assuming that you're going to get a negative mark-to-market at some time in the future, so that it would actually offset. You wouldn't have all positive, you would have some negatives in there. Now, termination means exactly what the name suggests, that it allows a party to terminate a trade for default or bankruptcy or the omission of some payments, and that's the breach of contract in that second part. But there are probably other reasons why you could terminate a contract. And so the way this works is that you can terminate the contract today, which means that you avoid making all of those payments in the future, but that implies that there has to be some kind of a payment made today. And there are two ways to do this: a walkaway feature and a reset agreement. And the walkaway feature, this is kind of interesting. It used to be used a lot of times, but look at that third block point there. They were quite common prior to 1992 agreement, but they're no longer a part. So how many years ago is that? I mean, that's a long time ago, decades ago. And so this doesn't sound like a really good exam question. But what this walkaway feature is a clause that effectively allows a financial institution to terminate the contract if that counterparty defaults. Now, the reset agreement, this is exactly what you would want. If you had a position and you had a counterparty and the two of you, were battling on the movement of interest rates or foreign exchange or equity markets, whatever it is, you would like to have the ability to go in and meet in the middle, much like the referee does in the middle of a basketball court or a football court. They meet in the middle and they try to figure out what's going on, right? And so we can reset the agreement, which might mean to change some of the parameters inside, maybe the terms of the contract. But what it also does, it's almost like executing a replacement transaction at that current market price. So it's, instead of having to go out and find another derivative to layer on top of this initial derivative, this reset agreement allows the two parties to meet and then try to figure out what that replacement is going to be. Now, there are a couple of additional termination events, ATEs, and these depend on things like maybe a ratings downgrade that depend on credit worthiness. And these are for institutions that have ratings by Moody's, but lots of institutions don't have ratings, like a hedge fund or maybe even a pension fund. And so you have to have some kind of a ratio to evaluate what that additional termination event might be. And so I have three listed there: market caps or net asset value, or if the fund manager decides to leave. And you could make anything else up in these additional termination events. Of course, you'd have to have both parties agree to sign. Now look at the warning that's at the bottom. You have this ratings downgrade. That might, and if this is an important financial institution, do I even want to use the term systematically important bank? How many times have we heard that in the last decade? And so you might want to be interested in replacing or terminating that contract. Now, I did say earlier that there wasn't any math involved in this chapter, and there is not, but this trade compression example probably gives you a good notion of how this might work, trade compression. So let's suppose that, look down the left-hand column, we've got 3 5-year credit default swaps with different notional amounts, and we have different positions. We have a long and then we have 2 shorts. Notice they all mature, those 3 mature on the same date, but they do have different coupons and they have different counterparties. And so instead of keeping track of the A and the B and the C, why don't we compress, right? I always think about it, like this, or squeezing into a vice. Why don't we just compress that total into one position? And so if you have the 40 as the long and the 25 and the 10 as the short, so that sums to 35. So you have 40 long and 35 short. So that's a net 5 long, right? Still have the same maturity date. And then to get the coupon, just do a quick weighted average, right? 200, what's 40 plus 10 is 50 plus, so that's 75. So do 40 out of 75 times the 200, 25 out of the 75 times the 150, and 10 out of 75 times the 300, kind of a weighted average coupon for your compressed trade. And that's just with the one counterparty. And so, looking at the green at the bottom, it's a lot simpler to keep track of the green than it is to keep track of the 3 blues. And I believe that takes us through. Boy, that last chapter was well over an hour, and this one wasn't.